Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Daniil Dubov playing black. Let's dive into this thrilling clash. Magnus Carlsen kicks off with pawn to e4, immediately taking control of the center, and Daniil Dubov counters with pawn to e5, setting the stage for a symmetrical opening. Magnus follows with knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and Daniil responds with knight to c6, developing his own knight. Magnus then plays bishop to b5, entering the classic Ruy Lopez opening, and Daniil, not backing down, pushes pawn to a6, attacking the bishop and forcing Magnus to make a decision. Magnus retreats with bishop to a4, maintaining pressure, while Daniil develops knight to f6, eyeing the vulnerable e4 pawn. Magnus solidifies his center with pawn to d3, and Daniil pushes pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side. Magnus, showing great positional understanding, retreats his bishop to b3, and Daniil develops bishop to c5, putting more pressure on the center. Magnus strengthens his position further with pawn to c3, preparing to solidify his control over the center, while Daniil responds with pawn to d6, aiming to complete his development. Magnus castles kingside, and Daniil moves rook to b8. Magnus develops knight to d2, and Daniil castles kingside. Magnus plays rook to e1, placing his rook on the open file, and Daniil develops knight to e7, possibly preparing to reposition it. Magnus then repositions his knight to f1, keeping his pieces flexible, while Daniil surprises with knight to g6, aiming to attack on the king side. Magnus plays pawn to h3, preventing any possible knight or bishop attacks on g4, and Daniil develops bishop to b6, eyeing the a2 pawn. Magnus then plays pawn to a4, challenging Daniil's queenside pawns, and Daniil responds with pawn to h6, making sure his kingside is secure. Magnus pushes pawn to a5, directly attacking Daniil's bishop, and Daniil retreats with bishop to a7, maintaining the long diagonal. Magnus seizes the opportunity to advance with pawn to d4, opening up the center, and Daniil counters with pawn to c5, striking at the heart of Magnus's position. Magnus then repositions his knight to g3, eyeing potential outposts on the kingside, and Daniil pushes pawn to c4, forcing Magnus's bishop to move. Magnus retreats his bishop to c2, maintaining his strong position, while Daniil pushes pawn to b4, gaining space on the queen side. Magnus places his rook on a4, eyeing Daniil's pawns on the queen side, and Daniil advances with pawn to b3, creating a powerful pawn chain. Magnus retreats his bishop to b1, keeping his pieces safe, and Daniil moves his queen to c7, preparing for potential attacks along the c-file. Magnus follows with queen to e2, developing his queen and keeping an eye on both wings, and Daniil responds by developing bishop to e6, solidifying his position. Magnus then plays pawn to d5, attacking Daniil's bishop and forcing a retreat. Daniil wisely moves his bishop to d7, keeping his defense solid. Magnus seizes the moment and captures the pawn on c4 with a rook, placing intense pressure on Daniil's position, while also threatening his queen. Daniil, feeling the heat, captures the pawn on a5 with his queen, creating a sharp tactical situation. The game is heating up. Magnus, sensing an opportunity, repositions his knight to f5, creating threats on the king side, but Daniil responds by capturing the knight with his bishop on f5. Magnus quickly recaptures with pawn on f5, solidifying his control in the center, but Daniil isn't backing down. He counters by repositioning his knight to f4, bringing more pressure to the board. Magnus wastes no time and captures Daniil's knight on f4 with his bishop, eliminating the threat. Daniil, undeterred, recaptures with pawn on e5, opening up his position and trying to create new chances. Magnus places his rook on f1. Daniil responds by bringing his rook to e8, centralizing his piece and putting pressure on Magnus's position. Magnus then moves his queen to d2, eyeing an offensive plan, but Daniil strikes by capturing pawn on d5 with his queen, forcing Magnus to react. Magnus quickly recaptures the queen on d5 with his own queen, but Daniil responds decisively by taking queen on d5 with knight, creating a material imbalance. Magnus moves his rook to d1, attacking the knight, but Daniil springs a brilliant counter by placing his rook on a2, sacrificing his knight on d5 to gain a tactical advantage. Magnus, not missing a beat, captures the knight on d5 with his rook, but Daniil takes pawn on a6 with his bishop, delivering a check on Magnus's king. Magnus moves his king to h1, avoiding the check, but Daniil is relentless. He captures pawn on b2 with his rook, further tightening his grip on the game. With the knight sacrifice in exchange for 2 pawns, Daniil now holds a dangerous passed pawn on b3. The pressure on Magnus's position is mounting, and Daniil's attack on bishop b1 intensifies. Magnus tries to regroup and moves his rook to d1, planning his next defensive move. Daniil remains aggressive, repositioning his bishop to e3, eyeing the king's side of the board. Magnus, looking to disrupt Daniil's plans, places his rook on c6, looking for counterplay, but Daniil is unfazed. He advances his pawn to a5, continuing his push on the queenside. Magnus seizes the moment and captures pawn on d6 with his rook, eliminating a key pawn. But Daniil answers with a move of his own, placing his rook on c2, eyeing Magnus's pawn. Magnus, realizing the growing pressure, he doesn't take the rook, but instead, he repositions his knight to e5, aiming to provide support and counterattack. Daniil, maintaining his calm, plays rook to f8. Magnus, now in a desperate attempt to counter, advances pawn to c4, but Daniil once again moves his rook to e2. Magnus repositions his knight to f3, looking to solidify his position, but Daniil keeps the pressure on with bishop to c5, placing more control on the center. Magnus then places his rook on a6, eyeing Daniil's pawns, but Daniil answers by moving his bishop to b4. Magnus decides to advance with pawn to c5, pushing forward on the queen side, while Daniil moves his rook to c8, looking to challenge Magnus's control. Magnus continues his advance with pawn to c6, gaining space, but Daniil moves his king to f8, preparing for the endgame. Magnus plays king to h2, and Daniil moves his rook to e7, keeping up his solid defense. Magnus then moves his rook to d3, attacking Daniil's isolated pawn, but Daniil counters with rook to c7, keeping the pressure alive on the queen side. Magnus repositions his knight to e5, trying to increase his control over the board, and Daniil pushes pawn to b2, advancing his dangerous passed pawn. Magnus responds with rook to b6, preventing further progress on the queen side, while Daniil moves his king to a7, possibly preparing to move towards the center. Magnus then plays rook to d7, delivering a check to Daniil's king and getting more advantage, and Daniil moves his king to f6, keeping the king safe. Magnus repositions his knight to g4, delivering another check, and Daniil moves his king to g5. Magnus moves his rook to b5, but Daniil moves his bishop to e1, holding strong. Magnus seizes an opportunity and advances pawn to f6, delivering a check, and Daniil moves his king to h4, avoiding the check. Magnus then repositions his knight to e5, and Daniil plays bishop to g3. Magnus moves his king to g1, positioning it for safety, and Daniil pushes pawn to g5, continuing to advance on the king side. Magnus captures pawn on c7 with rook, taking advantage of Daniil's exposed pawns, but Daniil recaptures with rook on c7, keeping his material balance intact. Magnus moves his rook to b7, attacking Daniil's rook, and Daniil moves his rook to ce8, defending his position. Magnus captures pawn on f7 with rook, gaining another pawn and increasing his advantage, but Daniil moves his king to a4, trying to create counterplay. Magnus, sensing the endgame is near, plays rook to h7, preparing for a potential breakthrough, while Daniil advances pawn to g4, pushing forward on the king side. Magnus captures pawn on h6 with his rook, creating more threats, and Daniil moves his king to g5, still fighting for survival. Finally, Magnus moves his knight to f7, delivering a checkmate that ends the game in his favor.